Great. So we are live with our online audience and, of course, our in-person audience here at the Siena Art Institute. So thank you all so much for being here in person. It's just great to see your faces and very much looking forward to having our chance to do a Q&A over some snacks also afterwards. So that's a big plus for joining us in person. But of course, we're glad to be able to expand our audience also with our online viewers with our live stream on YouTube and Facebook. So we'll just take a few moments as people see the notification and log on to join us. Just to mention that we're very much welcoming your questions or comments, and during the second part of the event, we'll save time for a Q&A. So definitely do feel free to ask questions during that Q&A session. For our online viewers who are joining us, we very much welcome questions and comments, and you can use the comment section to write any questions, which then we can respond to during the second part of today's event. So I'll just take a few moments to introduce today's speaker. Sarah Henstra is here not only this evening, but actually for our residency, which is, I guess, almost a 5-week residency here. So it's a little bit more than a month long, which is really wonderful to have her part of our community here. And together with, we also have a second resident artist, Farzad Labaf, who is from Iran and a painter now based in the US. And he'll be leading our presentation next Tuesday, the same time. So mark your calendars, save the date, and be sure to join us again next week for his presentation. But Sarah is coming to us from Toronto, Canada. She is a writer and a scholar specializing in 20th century British fiction. She is the author of 3 novels, including The Red Word, which won the 2018 Governor General's Literary Award for Fiction, Mad Miss Mimic from 2015, and We Contain Multitudes from 2019. Her monograph, the Counter-Memorial Impulse in 20th Century English Fiction, which came out in 2019, which examines the narrative effects of the unmournable loss in the fiction of such writers such as Ford Madox, Doris Lessing, and Jeanette Winterson. Recent scholarly publications include a study of the construction of women's mourning in British propaganda during World War I, and a pedagogical consideration of Jo Sacco's comics journalism. So this evening, however, not focusing on her academic writing, but she'll be focusing on her creative writing and her recent novels. So without further ado, I will turn the microphone over to Sarah.
Very much, Lisa, and thanks all of you for coming out of interest to meet me and see what it is that I do. And also, I just want to say I'm in love with Siena, as I'm sure all of you are too. I've been on several writing residencies this year. I'm on a sabbatical from my day job, which is university professor at Toronto Metropolitan University. I teach in the English Literature Department. So to have the chance to just immerse into my life as a novelist and to experience some different places has been fantastic. And Siena is by far my favorite, especially, the architecture and the art and the light in the city and the vintage clothes, because pretty much everything I'm wearing is bought at the charity shop downtown. And actually, I think I met a couple of you in there one day. Anyway, it's obviously something that Siena Art Institute students also know all about. I didn't bring nearly enough warm clothes for springtime in Siena, so that was my first stop, was to buy some vintage clothing.
You on purpose so that you could go.
Pretty much, yeah. I just do that wherever I go, buy a whole new wardrobe. Yeah. In the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to give you a very brief tour of the novels that I've published so far. I'm going to focus on my creative writing rather than my academic writing, as Lisa mentioned. And then I'm going to do a little bit of show and tell about my process, which is a little tricky to do if you're not a visual artist, right? It's like, look between the covers and there you have a bunch of words and not a lot else to show. But there are some steps along the way toward the finished product, of course, which takes years and years to write a novel. Then I'm going to spend the last 5 minutes or so reading from my most recent novel, the one that's coming out next year. And then I'd love it if you would those of you who are interested in creative writing or in writing fiction, especially to ask me any random questions that you might have about the writing life. So this on the screen is the cover of my first novel, my first published novel, Mad Miss Mimic. It's a Victorian detective story / romance with a kind of an opium trade plot. It takes place in 1872. Then my next novel that came out, this is the Canadian cover of the novel. It's called The Red Word, and it's a campus novel. It takes place on a university campus, which is kind of the place that I live as a professor and before that as a student. And it's a novel about a war between a fraternity house and a group of feminist students, undergraduate students, who are kind of up in arms about how women get treated at frat parties. And so it's a war of activism and a kind of a public campaigning. And that's The Red Word. And then We Contain Multitudes is an epistolary story. That means it's written completely in letters, the form of letters. And it's letters between two boys in a high school. Who sort of form an unlikely relationship across different social groups because of this letter writing assignment that their English teacher forces them to do. There is no cover for my forthcoming novel. It's called On Seeing. It's coming out next year in Canada at least, and then the dates are a little less certain outside of Canada, but it's that one is an art world mystery, so it might be of interest to some of you. It's a story of a surrealist painter in the 1930s who creates a deck of tarot cards, and then a contemporary art historian in a university who discovers those tarot cards and kind of puts together the story of who created them in the first place. So that's called On Seeing. And then the novel I'm working on here, the one I'm currently like up to my eye teeth in and have been for a couple of years now, the working title is Dragonfly, and it's the story of an environmental activist in the early 2000s who was involved in a firebombing incident at a coal refinery in West Virginia from the coal mining industry. And she's wanted, because of that, she's wanted by the FBI on eco-terrorism charges. And she's been raising her daughter basically under different names undercover since then. So the story is told from two perspectives: the perspective of the daughter, who is 13 years old and doesn't know the whole story of her mother's background and is discovering it, and the girl's father, who's recently been released from prison for the same crimes. So it's kind of everyone catching up with each other and trying to make sense of the past. As you can probably tell from these descriptions of these books, the subject matter is pretty wide ranging, and there isn't really a set of principles or a set of themes well, that's not true. There is a set of themes I return to over and over, but it's not immediately obvious when you look at the subject matter of my books. I think of myself and I describe myself as a curiosity-driven writer. But I think saying that to a bunch of artists is kind of like a really obvious thing to say, because I think all artists are more driven by curiosity than normal people are, right? That's what motivates us to dig in and underneath topics that swirl around in society and try to figure them out at a deeper level. So in my fiction, I explore experiences that often I haven't had those experiences firsthand, but I've been in some way adjacent to them, right? Obviously, I never lived in the Victorian era or, was involved in the opium trade, but certain themes or problems in my novels are things that I've been troubled by or I've been puzzling over, often in a kind of a secondhand way. So my fiction is not what I would call autobiographical or even autofiction, which I know is a very popular culture now, where an author will fictionalize her life but stay very close to events. I think it's a fascinating way of writing, and I have a number of writer friends who write a lot of autofiction. It's so far in my career, it's not really where I go as a writer. I go to places I haven't lived, but have this sort of curiosity about or have been involved with, and I want to know how the people at the heart of those events are thinking, and how they justify their actions to themselves, and how they resolve ethical and moral and social quandaries in their own minds. And that's where my imagination leads me. And one of the peculiarities of my career as a novelist is that I've written for two markets. I've written in both YA, young adult fiction market, and I've written in the sort of more mainstream literary fiction market, which means different editors and different publishers in those two markets. And they're very, very different audiences. Well, actually, that's not true. They're not different audiences, but they're different markets. The books are marketed and sold different ways, and the editors working in those two areas of publishing are often quite separate. So if anyone has any questions about that later, I'm happy to talk about that more. So just a word to switch gears, just a word or two about my writing practice. It took me many years to create a sustainable writing practice amid my full-time university career and my life as a parent and other obligations. When I was in my 20s and 30s, this is what used to happen to me. I used to have a great idea for a novel. And in a very short period of time, like over, sometimes a long weekend or a week or two, I would have this big rush of inspiration, and I would write and write and write and write, and I'd get 50 pages, 60 pages, and then I would abruptly run out of steam. And the work would go from feeling like this big flow of excitement to something really dull and uninspired. And I would just show up one day at my writing desk, and it would be boring instead of easy and exciting. And when that thrill wore off, when the inspiration dried up, I would conclude that the idea I'd had wasn't good enough to sustain me over 300 pages of a novel. And this happened to me a few times, and I kept wanting to be, novels is what I spend all my time reading, and it's what I wanted to write. And I did publish some short stories and a little bit of poetry, but I just couldn't figure out how to hold on to an idea long enough to sustain it over all the work that's required for a novel. So here are a few of the things that shifted for me in terms of my outlook or my perspective that allowed me to discover a more sustainable way of a writing practice. One of them is that I discovered at a certain point, or I guess I learned the lesson, that writing is in fact a discipline, and it's not something that by definition needs to be pleasurable, right? In the same way that a yoga practice or a meditation practice or any kind of fitness regime, it's not in itself constantly a source of euphoric transport out of reality where you're flying high. That's not how a sustainable practice of anything works, right? It's not a high. And instead, now I've learned that at its best, my writing practice, what happens is that I sort of forget myself while I'm writing for a couple of hours when I sit down to write. That's about the best that I can hope for while I'm writing, is that, and by forget myself, I mean, obviously I stop thinking about all my daily preoccupations. I lose track of time. Sometimes I will come around from the page after a couple of hours and I'm really hungry and I didn't realize it the whole time, or I'm cold, it's cold in the room and I didn't realize, but it's kind of a flow state, right, that I get into. And again, it's not a euphoric state. It's just a kind of a different level of consciousness where I'm not as aware of my immediate surroundings and the chatter in my brain. I like to call writing for myself, I call it humble drudgery. It's a bit like gardening or digging in the dirt, or like doing something it's not very exciting, but it has a longer term effect for me on how I feel and in my life that has become more and more important to me as I've learned to sustain a regular practice. What I've discovered is that I don't really feel like myself when I'm not writing regularly. It's kind of like after a few weeks of being out of my routine and not writing at all, I start to feel a little alienated from who I really am, right? It's just in the same way that someone who practices yoga and then doesn't for a while, or some other thing that keeps you healthy, you know when you're not your best self, right? And you know how to get back there if you do have a practice you rely on. So when the initial rush of an idea wears off, an exciting idea, I know that that's when the real work and dedication begins to the project. And I know to just stick with it, right? I have a whole list of things that I've discovered, like hacks that keep me going. I'm not going to go through them all, but again, I'm happy to share more of them if someone's really curious afterward. One other one that I will share is that I discovered the power of the very, very, very messy first draft of a novel. For me, one of the things that I'm very uncomfortable with is writing badly, writing poorly, like writing really, really crappy stuff, page after page after page. It's not my happy place. I think it's because I did well in school and I like getting good grades on stuff. And so for me to go to a place where I allow myself just to be a bad writer and get it down on the page and get that messy first draft out so that I then have something to work with, you know, to polish it up later. That's hard for me to do, but it's absolutely necessary for me to be able to move forward through a story without getting all stopped and blocked and wanting to polish up the first 10 pages until they shine like a gem. If I allow myself to go back at all and to start editing what I've written, I will never finish the draft. So I don't look back when I write. I just write blindly, heedlessly, quickly as I can, without censoring, without deleting, until I have a lot of pages of really, really bad writing. And then I have sort of like, if you think about it as clay and you're a sculptor, it's basically like getting globs of clay onto my desk so that I then have something to work with afterward. So that's another, the messy first draft, I would say, is another kind of breakthrough thing that I discovered that allowed me to start actually sustaining myself as a writer. I'm just going to do a little bit of show and tell about how I write.
Take the slides down.
Sure. So I write in journals by hand, and this is part of the messy first draft thing for me. It's a lot harder to go back and start editing when you can barely read your own handwriting and you're just filling the pages and turning the page and not reading what you wrote the day before. I use really fancy journals, as fancy as I can find. There's a couple brands I really like, and that's because they're so messy inside. And it just makes me feel better, like picking them up in the morning. They look pretty, but I write, this one doesn't have a lot in it because I just finished a different one, but I write in pencil. I don't erase. I scratch out when I need to and I keep going. And so I will go through probably maybe 6 of these when I'm writing the draft of a novel. And then, and also when I'm traveling or like I'm on the road, I would usually have a little one with me. This one I bought at the bookstore close to here. And it's actually an artist's journal. It has like drawings in it, which makes me really happy when I'm filling it up. I've only filled the first few pages, but I'm just writing in and around all the drawings, little things when I'm out on the town. Then after the downside of writing by hand, and it is a major downside, but for me, it's still worth it, is then I have to transcribe it all. It's like in the olden days, you know, the writer, I always think of him as male, you know, the writer would like hand all these messy handwritten pages to his secretary or his wife or something like that. And she would like dutifully type them all up into a typewritten manuscript. Well, that's me. I'm my own secretary. And I use different tricks like voice transcription, whatever will speed it up a little bit. But it is a really boring part of the process for me. And I try to squish it in like in times when my brain only has to be half working. What I will have after I do that is, you know, a document with like hundreds of pages of typed garbage, basically, which I then, sometimes I will cut and paste from it, but more often I will just have it beside me and I will start a new draft from scratch on a blank document on the computer. And I will throw the pages away, like crumple them up and throw them across the room, like in a really physical way. It makes me happy to like work my way through the garbage draft by creating a slightly more polished one out of it on screen. And I do a lot of reordering and prioritizing and throwing a lot of it away for my second draft. As you can see, it takes just as well, actually it takes longer. The second draft takes longer. If I write a first draft in 3 or 4 months, the second one will probably take more like 6 months or 8 months. Also because I just pulled these down from the walls of my studio down the hall. I do a lot of this type of thing, which is writing little shorthand of what happens in every scene and then changing the order of scenes. So these say things like, what happened at Wilmot? Concussion, like the evidence record. They discuss the New Yorker article. Like I'm the only one who could ever understand what any of this means. But as you can see, there are stacks of sticky notes on these this is what I've drawn here is a really crude grid of days. It's sort of like a calendar, but not really. It's just numbered. And this was actually from my last residency a couple months ago. I was trying to structure my time. And I had 24 days and here's what I want. Here are the scenes I wanted to work through in the draft that I had. And this is how I did it. And I moved these around quite a bit because I realized that the order that I'd written them the first time was not the most effective or the most exciting order. So I kind of allow things, I try to get a grip on what I've written by making little maps and stuff like that, stuff like this. They don't always look like, I do use sticky notes quite a bit because I like to be able to move them around. Here's another one. This one actually, I made this one. This is one of 3 pages. And I kind of sometimes think of a novel as Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. And so I wrote, before I even started writing my first draft, you can see under all this craziness, under all these sticky notes, there's just a pencil. And I wrote out a list of the scenes that I thought belonged in the 3 parts of the book. And then I wrote my draft, but as I did, because I don't go back and fill in, these are all the things I realized were missing or needed fixing as I went. And I would just write it on a sticky and stick it on. And these are the two different narrators. That's why there's a column. That's why there's 2 columns. And so this is just me like finding any old way to visualize and summarize what I'm doing when I'm writing a draft and try to leave myself a trail of structure, or plan a little map of structure for myself. So I'm not writing in a big, blank space, just following my characters. I'm not a believer in following your characters wherever they want to go, because I think what that leads to is hundreds of pages of useless writing. It's great for getting a sense of who the character is, but when you want to generate material you're actually going to be able to use to structure a plot, I think it's better to have some form of outline in your mind, a general arc of what's going to happen in this story and where things are heading. This one is in some ways the silliest. I'm kind of embarrassed, but also I'm not embarrassed because this is just what works for me. This is receipt tape from a cash register. You can buy it at the store at like papers, like Staples and other stores like that. And I will often have 5 or 6 of these lined up on my wall, stuck to my wall, first on my desk and then on my wall. And these are like different threads of the plot. So these ones, one says past and the other one says prison. There was also future, and there was also like the daughter's backstory. Like I just make them for any line of the story, and I'll write down the scenes I've got or the scenes I need, and I'll try to line them up. And that helps me think of a kind of an overarching arc to the story. Everything kind of has to be happening in a sort of a direction toward a climax or a kind of catastrophe toward the end of the story. And it's hard to keep track of all those different threads unless you actually make threads, well, in this case, lines out of them. And here you can see the lines. It's hard to show and tell this. The lines, those are just divisions between different sections of the book, right? And this is me trying to figure out how to line up these different elements of the story. And it's quite concrete, and I will make I just throw these away when I'm done with them and make more as needed. Receipt tape is cheap. It's not no one's ever going to see this except for you guys when the book is published. So, it can look as, sometimes they stretch all the way across my living room floor because it's just, that's how many scenes there are. And I need to make sense of, it's the thing about fiction, right? Is that writing in general, but I think fiction more than poetry, it evolves in a straight line over time. It's not like a painting where you can grasp it all at once. You're stuck in time when you're writing fiction. So managing the timeline in your story is a big part of kind of trying to get a grip on what you're writing. Okay, so I have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to read to you a little bit, just a couple of pages. This is from the novel that I mentioned is coming out next year in 2024, the one called On Seeing, about that creation of the deck of tarot cards by a surrealist painter. And this is just the first pages. So the way this novel is structured is it has 22 chapters, and each chapter, or each section, I guess, has the title of the name of a tarot card, because there's 22 cards in the major arcana of the tarot, which are the cards that actually have titles, like the Empress and the Priestess. And so I structured the novel that way because it's about a deck of tarot cards. So this is chapter 0, which is actually a kind of a preface. 0 in the tarot is the Fool, and that's where the book begins. On the last day of her Uncle Corvo's life, Nell Larkin paid her final visit to the Moss Throne. September 18th, 1938. Breathing the steely pre-dawn air, she looked down over the meadow and almost laughed in her relief at being awake and unsmothered. It was the flimsiest time of day, when night was still peeling back from the world. This was near Kilndown, East Sussex, the idyllic, Edenic home of the community Corvo Ringgold had named the Shone. Well, formerly idyllic. Descending the hill toward its ruins, Nell saw that the fire had left perforations everywhere, like a ripped seam between dark and light. The buildings had fine threads rising off them that blurred into the moth-eaten sky. Nell snuck a look at the lodge to be certain her uncle wasn't watching her out the window. Corvo lay in a hospital in London, siphoning the last dribble of oxygen into his charred lungs. He was not staring out at her and tracking her movements past the walled garden or down the lane. Yet she could almost see him twitch the curtain in the window, almost the flash of his silver rings as the curtain sylphed into ash, and Corvo's face a black crust with glaring, lidless eyes. Nell was 22 years old and pretty well the only one left. She turned her gaze on the gold gleam at the horizon, and in the burnt hayfield, a mayhem of starlings dodged among the furrows, too impatient for full dawn, hunting what? Insects, maybe. A legion of creatures had burrowed down into the soil for safety from the flames and were creeping up again this morning only to be met with fresh slaughter. The odor of stale smoke fisted into Nell's throat, and she started running, aiming herself away from both the night horrors behind her and the day horrors all around. She crossed through the orchard, vaulted the stiles either side of the road, entered the wood, and climbed a steep hill where deadwood littered her path and burrs clustered her socks. Then down the other face of the ridge, Nell dug her heels into the earth and planted her hands behind her to slow her slide. Halfway into the ravine was the broad chalk shelf where in March and April, Simon Shawcross had collected roots from the Tunbridge filmy fern. In the spring, the whole gill, Simon called it. Was that an official geological term, or had he made that up? The whole gill was mud slick. This rock shelf seeped moisture. But now, in mid-September, the ferns were dense and spongy as if they'd soaked up and were hoarding all the water. The chalk was smooth and cold under Nell's palm. It was Simon who showed her the treasure at the bottom of the gill, a massive vertical stone slab, a broad stone seat, tall stone arms, every surface furred with vivid green, the Moss Throne. Simon had showed her what to do here. He showed Nell everything in those last months, as if he knew they were running out of time. The air down here was strange, the color and density and scent of an alien planet. They were always encroachers down here, always a pair of vagabonds on some foreign, furtive business. The way Simon explained it, mosses don't remember faces. And now Nell was all alone, a solitary fool on a fool's errand. Silence stuffed her ears. Her shoes and socks came off, and then the rest of her clothes. She had never felt such a stranger in her own skin, moon white. The throne was tall as a forest queen, 3 times taller than Nell. Nothing welcoming about it. Nothing useful down here for any human enterprise save the survival of her soul. Naked, Nell climbed up and knelt backward on the moss seat, gasping as the chill seeped into her kneecaps. She flattened her thighs and belly to the throne's back, raised her hands to chest level, and dug her fingertips in. Ice-cold water ran to her armpits and across her ribs. The moss throne's back was a saturated sponge filled by an underground source whose water never warmed. A shiver quaked her spine, and she laughed at the way her muscles clenched and flinched, body versus brain. She stood up, rotated, and leaned back into the moss so that the water sluiced down her spine and buttocks. She rolled her head, soaking her hair until her skull ached. Turning again, she opened her mouth and went in, nose first, tonguing the moss and kissing it and swallowing mouthful after mouthful of its spring water. When she couldn't feel her feet, when even her molars were numb, Nell dismounted the throne and lay flat amid the dry, rubbery ferns. Her pulse thrummed over every inch of her skin from neck to ankles. She might have been levitating. Nell did what Simon had shown her, what he'd done for her when they'd lain in the ferns together, their laughter splintered with shivering. She put her cold hands between her legs and pulled all the sensation to a single burning point. The moss flavor traveled down from the roof of her mouth to the root of her sex, and then finally out back into the moist world where it belonged. Afterwards, she rolled onto her belly and went to sleep. Her dreams down here were less suffocating and funereal. What woke her again, minutes or hours later, was a warm nudge to her hip. She lifted her head from the ferns and saw a fawn, a half-grown deer with its spots mostly faded, but its eyes still liquid with innocence. At her sudden movement, it sprang straight into the air, all 4 hooves off the ground. It wheeled, leaped for the bush, and in an instant had vanished. The Fool is the first card of the Tarot's major arcana, the first and the last, numbered 0, which is no number at all. This Fool has a peculiar relationship with survival. He is all alone, fresh-fledged from the nest and terrifyingly inexperienced. Head bared to the sun, he takes to the cliffside road without a compass or forwarding address. Yet we know for certain he'll be the last one standing, the only one left to tell the tale. For all his lollygagging and wool gathering, he's the one we'll have to rely on in the end to set the record straight. Okay, so that's it. That's me. That's my writing. Does anyone have any questions?
Yes.
First up.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. And well done.
Thanks. I realized halfway through reading that's the first time I've ever read that out loud. And there was like some parts where I was like, wow, there's a lot of F's in that sentence. I think reading aloud is a really, really important way of proofreading. And this has undergone so much editing in the last few months because it's coming into book form now that I need to read it out loud again, just to find the places where, the prose gets a bit stumbly.
I was fascinated with your process. Thank you, especially for sharing that. I have 2 questions. The first question is, in your outlines that you showed us both the physical in your mind, when you outlined the arc of your fiction, do events in your personal life shift that possibly throughout time and vice versa? Does that storyline that you have in mind affect you in your personal life through the time that it unfolds?
Did you type that question or do you want me to repeat it?
Actually, I think it came through in the audio.
Oh, okay. All right.
Since you're close, it came.
That's a great question. And I think you're asking, well, there's a couple of bits of it there. One is, how does real life intersect with what I'm writing? And the other is how my intentions for the story can change throughout the process, because, you know, it's months and months, right? Years and years, really, from start to finish. Yeah, I would say that my outlines that I make, my intentions for where a story is going to go, are quite permeable to my experience and to other things, bits of research that I do, conversations that I have. Usually, I have two things that stay more or less the same. One is what writing instructors call the inciting incident. It's like the thing that kicks off the action. Like, why is this day like no others, right? If you've ever like taken a course in creative writing, they talk about the inciting incident in a story as something that creates a problem or the need for a narrative. And then the other thing is like the climax or the catastrophe of the story, where all the action comes to a head, and there's like the classic battle scene, or the slaying the dragon scene, or, you know, it's usually not a dragon and it's usually not an actual battle, but it's some form of everything coming to a point where it needs to be dealt with, and it's toward the end of the novel. And usually those two parts of the plot are pretty fixed for me, because for me they're integral to the idea for the story. When I think, oh, I'd like to write a novel about an activist, you know, who gets caught or gets caught up in a disaster and then has to live her life, you know, on the run. I've got some parts of her story pretty set in my mind, but all the other little details along the way, how we get from that inciting incident to that sort of final catastrophe or that coming together of the story, a lot of that shifts around and changes. And in fact, it needs to, because it's about pacing. It's about taking readers along a journey in a way that's going to feel inevitable and create a sense of momentum. Really quick anecdote about my novel, We Contain Multitudes. I had decided to set the story in Minneapolis for various reasons, in part because I live in Toronto and I wanted the novel to take place at an American high school in an American city. And after visiting Minneapolis a few times, I realized that would be an easy place for me to set a story, because Toronto and Minneapolis are roughly similar in terms of climate and seasons, and so shortcut there. The father of one of the characters is a musician and is involved. They're all kind of involved in the music scene. And I am a massive Prince fan from the time that I was about 13 years old. And at a certain point, I'd say well into the writing of that novel, Prince passed away in 2016, and the novel is set in 2016. And I realized there was no way I was going to be able to set a novel in Minneapolis in 2016 without that. Oh, actually, I had already decided that Prince had to just come into the story. And then while I was writing the book, Prince passed away. So what happened was he became this kind of like little bit of backstory that I was just doing for my own pleasure to a major part of the plot of the novel, or at least a big event that shapes what happens in the novel. So that was an example of how reality came in, and I was like, this has to be part of the story, obviously, and it sort of changed the direction of things a little bit.
Thank you very much. And just quickly, the second question is, I don't know why, but just the visuals of how you were outlining everything made me want to wonder, have you ever thought about or considered writing a play?
Yeah, I think also that the way I said Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, there's a lot of overlap, right? I think between writing fiction and screenwriting for TV and film as well, and playwriting. And in fact, I have a good writer friend whose novel is called The Mother Act, and it's about a one-woman play about a woman who abandons her daughter for her theater career. And she's really this is my friend Heidi Reimer. Her book's coming out next year as well. She actually is surrounded by theater people in her life, and she's been involved. She's co-written the play, and so for her, it's a natural extension, the two things. The difference is that on stage or on camera in a movie, it's entirely external. what the audience gets. Everything has to be in dialogue, or everything has to be in stage directions, right? Or camera angles in the case of a movie. What a novel has that those other forms of art don't have is interiority. You can see inside a character's mind, and you can spend a whole lot of time inside a character's mind and memories and stream of consciousness. And for me, I would hate to give that up. I think that I'm fascinated with playwriting and screenwriting, but I think for me, I would feel that things are becoming more restrictive for sure. And of course, constraints are a big motivator in art. The more constraints you put on a project, the more productive that can be. For example, the constraint of writing the whole novel in letters in We Contain Multitudes, right? That was something that helped me get that book finished, because it was a challenge to do it as a writer. But yeah, that's the difference for me between that type of writing, playwriting or screenwriting, and fiction, is that with fiction, you get that whole other dimension of the interior life of a character, right? And you can try to convey that in a play or in a movie, but the tools are more limited, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
We had a few,
there were just a few questions that came in from our online viewers. I think you've actually answered several of them already. One question just asking about your, this is a question asking the tools you have created for helping organize your story. Are they unique to you, or are these techniques that are taught in creative writing classes?
That's a good question. What I sort of showed there was a kind of a collage of a bunch of different techniques that I've learned from other writers and other instructors over the years. My friend, who's an author named Catherine Kutenbrauer, she also has her novel's coming out this year, her latest novel. You can ask me how to spell her name later if you want to. Kutenbrauer, it's a Dutch name. But the receipt tape thing, that's from her. She just said, hey, look, I was struggling with sticky notes and poster board. And she was like, you know what's useful? And she gave me this roll. And I was like, how am I supposed to use this? And she just showed me. And that's been something I've found really helpful since then. One writing instructor I really admire and I've used his methods a lot. His name's Al Watt, W-A-T-T. And he has a book called The 90-Day Novel, which sounds, when you first hear about it, it sounds like, oh, come on. It's like, write your novel in 90 days. But actually, what's amazing, first of all, he's got an amazing sort of bedside manner as a writing instructor. He has a way of anticipating all the doubts and fears and blocks that can happen along the way of writing a novel, and just giving you the little pieces of advice that you need at that particular stage of writing. And also the 90-day novel, I mean, it dovetails very nicely with what I was talking about when I discovered the power of a messy first draft, of not looking back and slowing yourself down, but just letting the whole draft come out in whatever form it's going to take, and then being able to reshape it in a subsequent draft, right? So you actually have some concrete material on the page to work with. And so that's what his book is all about. It's how to do that in a short, compressed period of time. And he's the one who suggests that your outline can be as simple as 3 pages, 1 for each act of the novel. In fact, he includes in the book, the 90-Day Novel, he includes what he calls the structure questions. And he just, you go through in about 10 minutes and you answer the questions, the structure questions. There's like a set of questions for Act 1, a set of questions for Act 2, and you just answer them kind of almost stream of consciousness. And then that becomes your 3-page outline that you use to work through this messy first draft. So it's a pretty straightforward way of setting up some basic structure for yourself before you go writing off into some cul-de-sac that you can never get out of, which has happened to me before, and I'm sure it happens to a lot of writers.
I was interested whether you've worked or whether you work regularly with one or many editors, and what role do they have in terms of your work? What contribution do they give?
Mm-hmm.
How would you describe it?
I have worked with a solid handful of editors over the course of my career, in part because I write in 2 separate markets and there's different editors. It's writing fiction is different than writing a nonfiction book, like a researched book on a topic of nonfiction, because when you write nonfiction, you often write a couple of sample chapters and a proposal, like an outline, and then you submit it. And an editor who likes the idea will then work with you for helping you shape the project. With fiction, you have to finish the manuscript before you can submit it to publishers. They want to see, unless you're really famous already and you're like, I have a 5-second idea. And they're like, we'll buy it. That doesn't happen to normal people. So you have to write the manuscript and get it as clean and finished as you can. And then an editor at Penguin Random House or Doubleday will consider it for public and will acquire it or not acquire it. So the working with editors often comes later, but then once the book has been acquired by that editor, then it gets reshaped quite a bit in my experience, at least so far in my career. They will love it. They'll love the story. I can imagine the audience for this. I'd love to give you an advance for this book. And you say, great. And then you sign the contract. And then the work begins of really digging in and revising it a lot. And my novels have all changed a lot from the time they get bought by a publisher to the time they actually come out in print. There's a lot of work to be done in revision. And I find that an incredibly challenging but valuable part of the process of being a writer, because the editor becomes almost kind of a midwife, helping take that book. Well, that's going to be a birth metaphor that I don't want to carry through with. I've heard it. Like, I gave birth to my book baby. But let's put that aside and just say that writing is a very private act. It's you and the page and your mind, and you can do as much work as you're capable of to create, to make it a story that readers can enter into and experience in a coherent way. But the editor is the person who helps really shepherd it from being this private sort of thing, that you've created, to being something that a public can access. And so for me, that process is fascinating and really, really rewarding, even though it requires all kinds of compromises along the way, right? Compromises because you have your precious ideas about the way things should be, and you have to give them up, a lot of them up, in order to create a text that readers can enter and enjoy and experience.
So frustrating as well.
Sometimes frustrating. And I have this, like, from having some experience with this now, I know that for myself, I go through like these various stages, kind of like stages of grief, like utter outrage when I first read the editorial notes, like, what, this person's an idiot. They didn't understand the story at all, to like a sense of deep shame. Like, I'm such a bad writer. I didn't even know this book was why did they buy it? And then a kind of real sense of, despair about my own skills. And then, like, usually around day 4, I'm ready to be like, you know what, like, things will start to pop into my mind. This is a solvable problem. Okay, I understand. Like, oh, you know what I could do? Like, I can get back in the driver's seat. But it always takes me a little while. And I just know to not, like, I'll get the notes over email and then do not schedule the phone call with the editor for the next day. Like, give it a week, let it sink in, let myself work through all those different stages of, wounded artist, right?
What do you prioritize when you write, or try to prioritize? I'm sure there's a lot to juggle, but like you said, you don't want to follow your characters per se. Like, for you, is there a message you're trying to convey in each story, or is it about like exploring a scenario? What's most important to you?
That's a great question, because I'm often looking for that thing when I'm writing a draft. It's hard to hang on to the guiding light. Like, what am I aiming for? It's easy to start sliding around and feeling like the story is losing its direction. It's not message. It's not, this is what I hope people get out of this book. If I think too much about the book world and what it's saying to readers, I can't write at all. So like I said, it really is it's a transaction between me and myself on the page. And it is this kind of like private fascination or curiosity that I'm trying to follow when I'm writing. My first drafts are really, well, I was going to say they're for myself, but they're so bad that I don't even like. But I would say that like draft 2 and 3, like the one I'm working on now on my novel about the environmental activist, I feel like the draft I'm doing now, which is taking the raw material and starting to craft scenes from it that are more, I'm more interested in the language. I feel like that draft is for me, and that subsequent draft will be like, oh, okay, I love this, but it's 5 pages too long, this whole section. You know, that will be more of my critical self starting to take over. I look for tension. I would say that's what you said, what do I prioritize? I think I prioritize tension when I'm writing. In every scene I'm trying to get down on the page, I look for, where is the conflict here? Where is the tension in the scene where this person's desire kind of comes up against something, whether it's an obstacle in the outside world or another person's agenda in a conversation. And I know that makes it sound like, oh, the whole world is a battleground, you know, whatever. But I do think that's where the energy of a story comes from, are in all the moments of tension. And sometimes sometimes the tension in a scene is buried. Sometimes nobody's saying what they mean. In fact, most of the time, characters in a novel are, in real life too, people are not saying what they really think. And that's where the tension comes from. It's like the difference between what's being spoken and what's not being spoken. Sometimes it's tension between a beautiful spring day and a glorious flower garden and like the black emotion that the character is experiencing in contrast to that, right? But whatever it is, my priority is finding the tension in whatever scene I'm trying to write. And also to convey concrete detail. So to never let myself kind of drift off into thematic, philosophical musings about the past and the future, but to keep myself in the concrete sensory detail of a scene. Like, what are the smells? What are the sights? What is the itch on the character's skin? Like, keep it really present. Even when I'm describing a flashback or a memory or something, is to try to stay out of generalizations. You can always add a few sentences of thematic generalization or philosophy later, but if a reader's going to be interested, they have to be caught up in the sensory details of a scene from moment to moment. So I would say those are my 2 priorities. And the other thing that I write for myself that I find most rewarding is finding the voice of a character, the unique ways that a character sees the world. And so voice isn't just a spoken thing, right? It's like a whole point of view of how a character would tell a story. And for me, the voice doesn't always come, like I have writer friends who can't even put one word down until they have the voice in their head, the character's voice, and that allows them to start telling the story. I wish that was true for me, but it often takes me well into a second or a third draft before I start to catch the glimpse of, like, start to catch the thread of the character's voice. And I feel like, knock wood, that's sort of what's starting to happen now with my latest novels. I'm starting to feel like I'm getting the rhythm of the character's voice. And I've already got like 400 something pages of draft with no voice in it that I'm happy about yet. That's my rewrite, is like writing it into this voice of this character. It's a super weird experience, but yeah.
Couple of writers that you love?
Oh, writers that I love. Well, I'm Canadian. Alice Munro is one of my all-time heroes. She's actually a short story writer, but her short stories create worlds, basically, as well as any novel does. I also have always been a big fan of Margaret Atwood, another monster Canadian writer. And in fact, one of the things that really inspires me about Margaret Atwood, other than the fact that she just keeps going, and I want to be writing when I'm her age, is the way that she writes across different genres, right? She writes literary fiction, she writes dystopian fantasy, she writes like kind of close to memoir-ish type fiction. And if she writes poetry, she writes short stories. And I find that really inspiring in terms of her range. I am a big fan of George Saunders, the American writer. And I love like I'm a big reader of the classics, right? I did a PhD in English literature, so I just reread. I reread several of D.H. Lawrence's novels during the pandemic, and kind of really, George Eliot also. These are books I read in grad school and I've taught them. And I just find that when I go back now with kind of new eyes and new experiences, and I read some of these 19th century novels, they're a whole new world again that I don't remember reading the first time, or I see them in new ways. So yeah, those are some of my favorites.
Well, probably in the interest of time, we should wrap things up, but definitely our in-person audience can continue the conversation over some snacks. But thank you all so much for joining us. Also, our online viewers, thank you for joining us, and thank you for all the questions. And just a reminder, this same time next week, we'll have Farsad Labaf, who is the painter from Iran, who is going to be presenting his work, since he's also one of our residents here at the Siena Art Institute for this month. So definitely hope to see you all back here. Thank you so much, Sarah. This was such a wonderful glimpse into your creative process and very, very inspiring. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
For having me.